And thanks, Tom. I want to just do a quick recap uh, as to what's going on. And the reason for this is that there are some considerable changes that take place in North America. And I just want to bring us back up to speed very quickly. I'm going to not show these slides. We saw them before, and they don't really matter in this situation. But in 1754, as we talked about before, George Washington was sent out to advise the French who were building forts along the Allegheny River and approaching the forks of the Ohio to get out of Dodge. And of course, they refused. He went back to Virginia. He was told again to go back out and build a fort at the forks of the Ohio. But before he got there, he ran into a small French group in a rocky glen, ambushed them, killed a number of the soldiers there, and the principal officer who was wounded was carrying papers which were to advise the English, because they were English at the time, to get out of Dodge themselves because they were going to establish forts in French territory. Unfortunately, that particular officer was killed by an Indian, had his head smashed in, and it created all kinds of misery that subsequently came to it. Now, I showed this because there's been a series of questions about the differences in culture. And while this particular gentleman was referencing labor as well as the racial climate at the time that he wrote this, it emphasizes something very basic and permeates much of the history that we've talked about. And that is basically no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. If you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization. And this kind of philosophic approach can be applied to many, many different things. But it particularly emphasizes the nature of the cultural divide between Native Americans and the Europeans, and subsequently, especially between the British and the Native Americans. This was just a very quick reprise of the area in which Washington went up to try to convince the French to leave. Here is Fort Pitt that you can see right there on the screen. And Fort Necessity, which was Washington's supply depot at the time that he was trying to convince the French to leave. And subsequently, when Fort Necessity was captured by the French and he was forced to sign an instrument of surrender, which indicated that he was responsible for the killing of the French envoy, he was allowed to return back to Virginia, given the so-called honors of war. And after that, the British colonists and governors realized that they were into a big fight. That's Fort Necessity. Okay. Now, in terms of what happened in 1755, this lower segment, we covered a portion of it with Braddock, who was sent from England with regular troops to drive the French out of the lands that the British said they claimed. Now, the borders were very porous. They weren't defined at all strictly. And when Braddock arrived, he actually wanted to achieve 4 different objectives. And as a consequence, it took him nearly a year to plan out the operations, gather the supplies and the manpower, and move ahead. Now, somewhat out of sequence, but in July of, going forward, Why is it doing that? There we are. Yep.
All right, this is blocking the camera.
Okay. I don't know what happened there, but we'll keep going. Okay.
Just set it on the floor.
Let me hold the picture for you.
Okay.
Okay.
We're going to have one technical problem each lecture without much question. So Braddock on the left was an accomplished general, knew how to organize, knew how to conduct military affairs, but in his particular traverse, as he ended up experiencing just as he was reaching Fort Duquesne, which had inferior numbers of French, and the French commander at that fort realized he could not withstand a siege, ambushed Braddock and inflicted enormous casualties on him. Washington was present and tried to help rally the troops, but basically they were driven out. And I'm going to go past these quickly because I want to get to the essence of where we need to be today. Braddock had 3 other campaigns that were going on simultaneously, none of which could assist the other. And important to that is that what happens in 1755 has a major impact, not only in North America, but now begins to have repercussions in Europe. And I'll come to that in a little bit. I want to show you this because it demonstrates something of great importance and how this will have an influence on how this war is going to unfold. You'll notice that in just 50 years, the number of English colonists escalates enormously. In comparison, while if you look at it as a proportion, you might say, look, the French actually increased themselves by a considerable number more. In this situation, nowhere near the recruitment capacity that exists for the English. And this will have great repercussions in what happens later in the conflict. And then the other part of this is this diminution. Now, notice that I put all Native Americans in North America, all right? That's an amazingly small number, considering that a good portion of the population was in the Southwest and scattered through some parts of the Midwest. So when you look at those numbers, you realize that through the entirety of North America, they may have had even fewer numbers than the English colonists. Huge implications for the future. I bring this up as well because as I stumbled through the demographics, the number of slaves in North America, as we look at the English colonies, had risen from 27,000 to 150,000. Notice how many are in Jamaica alone. Now, the southern colonies, as you'll see, have 80% of the enslaved. In the north, they were more urban-related. Okay, I thought we just had somebody get clocked with one of George's implements. Okay. And the slide demonstrates how different influences affected the number of slaves that were being brought in. And I'm not going to go back into that history. I just want you to understand that the dynamics we're seeing in the 50 years of the 1700s, the slave population in North America goes up considerably, but still the vast number of slaves were taken into the Caribbean region. The critical terrain I talked about briefly before. The purpose of this slide is simply to demonstrate that it was easier to pass up through a river valley than it was to try to cross these mountains. And the same was true heading up north. These locations represent 2 of the 4 sites that Braddock had designated for attacks against the French. And this was his other attack, which was to use naval power, British naval power, which was clearly ascendant, to transport troops over a great distance and strike at important places to stretch the French defenses. And that initial landing is up here at Fort Beauséjour, and it cuts off the land connection to Louisbourg, which is a major French port, and protects the entrance to the St. Lawrence. Fort Beauséjour and Fort Gaspereau are really not ports worth very much. Halifax is more of a port that's useful. But the key issue was to muster this many troops, you had to start down here, and Monckton is going to go up there and take that region and cut this peninsula. However, his force is too small to take on Louisbourg. Just can't do it. That'll come later. Part of the consequence of this attack, however, and British control in various locations, not involving Louisbourg, led to the Second Arcadian expulsion. There have been several, and this one takes place over a 9-year period. It's not instantaneous. I talked about this a bit before when Cornwallis began one of the first expulsions. But this became more dramatic simply because the British initiative was to drive out the French and allow areas to be open to settlement, which could be peaceful. The Arcadians were not seen as being very peaceful because they did not commit themselves to support the British crown. And as a result, they were basically kicked out. So the conflicts that are going on have a level of, we'll call it brutality associated to them, but this was not an attempt in one sense to kill all these people. It was to clear the region so that we could establish comfortable settlements and be protected from raids and subversion. And there are a lot of instances, unfortunately, in human history where this kind of action takes place. Consequently to this, also, I mentioned that, remember, this is not war in the sense that France and Britain have committed themselves to declare war. This is all confined to North America. Europe is still relatively peaceful, but I'll come to that in a minute. The other thing the British did, and we can begin to look at them as the instigators of all of this, was to say, we know that the French are going to try to send troops to North America. Don't let them get there. Well, a number of the ships do make it, one of them carrying a French general by the name of Montcalm and another Descaux, whom we'll come to later. But more importantly, they do intercept 3 French ships, 2 of which are carrying regular French soldiers being transported to North America. Now think about the implications of what is going to happen. Hocquart on the French ship Alcide says, are we at peace or at war? And what does Howe say? Oh, we're at peace, we're at peace. And then when he gets close enough, he opens fire on them, all right? Wrecks their primary ship, which is forced to surrender along with one of the transports. One of the 3 ships that they encounter gets away. And all of the French regulars are treated as prisoners of war, even though war hasn't been declared, but they're sent back to England and then eventually could be sent back to France in a semi-exchange fashion. But notice what was being carried. Okay. So the French were aware of British ambitions. They were aware of what the British were ultimately going to try to do. And they felt, who's our best ally? Because our population is relatively low and the British are always encroaching on Native American lands. Let's help them. So that's what goes on. Now, the second, call it, of Braddock's initiatives was to go up from Albany and follow the Mohawk River, come to the crossing place, enter the lakes, and then go up to Fort Oswego. Well, there isn't much of a fort there, actually. But he arrives and he builds a defensive structure and a supply base. And then he wants to move along what I've indicated as the intended route towards Fort Niagara, which he is supposed to take. And under Braddock's initiative, Braddock is to come up to Fort Duquesne, which is at current Pittsburgh, and then go north and eventually meet up with him. And as we know, Braddock never got there. Similarly, Shirley finds out that as he begins to move along the south coast of Lake Ontario, he's running out of supplies, he's encountering increasing resistance, he's lost a number of people to illness, okay? And finally just says, the heck with it, it's not working, I'm going back. The other attempt they make is to move up from Albany towards the bottom edge of Lake George. They established this Fort Lyman, which later becomes named Fort Edward. And if you're traveling up past Albany and heading up north, you'll see signs to these places. There's not much there to see, but you can walk the ground where these things happened. William Johnson had been the British designee as the controller, if you will, or the delegate, or the intermediary with most of the Native American tribes in upstate New York, particularly, of course, the Iroquois. And he felt and had experience dealing with them and could use them as part of his scouting forces and so on. But in this particular situation, this is primarily what I'll call regular army. Now that involves some regular British units, but it also involves provincials who are reasonably well trained, and then militia, not very well trained. And as they move up and establish Fort Lyman as a supply base, the next thing he wants to do is create Fort William Henry. But in the course of that, he sets up a camp. The distance between Lyman and Henry is about 20-something miles. And in the meantime, the French have not been quiet. They know what's going on. They understand where the threats are. So they send regular troops down to Fort St. Frederick, that you'll see at the top of that slide. And from there, come down the west side of Lake Champlain, and they establish Fort Carillon. Now, that fort had not been there before. But they start building it because they recognize that the water route, if you go up Lake George, is just a quick jump to Lake Champlain. And if you can get to Lake Champlain, then you've got all of Lake Champlain that you can traverse by boat, even though Fort St. Frederick has the capacity to interdict it. But the idea is if they get past you, they've cut you off from supplies. So they want to build this fort here. But in the meantime, they know that Johnson is coming up from Albany. So Descaux, who had been sent by the French, is sent down initially to take Fort Lyman and destroy it and hopefully cut Johnson off and maybe destroy him en route. When he gets down here at the bend, the Native Americans who were with him basically say, listen, that's too strong a fort. We're not interested in that. We're here for a couple of things. We're here for loot. We're here to get paid because you've offered us all kinds of things. And we're here to get prisoners. And if we lose a lot of people attacking this fort, that's not what we're after. So Descaux turns and figures out that he'll attack Johnson's camp because that's minimally fortified. And en route, he actually engages with a small force that Johnson has sent down, having learned that Descaux is coming his way. They get trounced and he retreats back to his fort, but he's attacked 3 times at that fort. They hold him off, and interestingly, as you'll see down at the bottom, reinforcements begin to come up from Fort Lyman, and a dual attack by Johnson and the reinforcements from Lyman actually defeat the French, and they captured Descaux, who is almost killed by another Native American, but Johnson allegedly saves him. So that brings us to 1756, and this is where the transformations become profound. First of all, I have Europe erupts May 56, when war is declared, but I put this events leading to war as an underlying principle to keep in mind about what happened. The War of Austrian Succession in Europe pitted Prussia, France, Sweden, and Spain against Britain, Austria, and Russia. This is important to keep in mind because further down we're going to see how this suddenly blows up in Europe. Jumonville, Braddock, naval combat. This has already got France and England at odds with each other. Now they're really looking at each other, not just with a wariness, but war is coming. And how do we set ourselves up to be successful in this kind of war? And there's something called the diplomatic revolution. Treaty of Westminster, Britain felt and Austria felt that their connection really wasn't working. And that relates to what happened during the War of Austrian Succession. Similarly, Russia says, yeah, I don't think I need to be working with the Brits anymore. You know, I've got some other things on my mind. And particularly the one I'm worried about is that guy in Prussia, Frederick the Great, so-called. So when Britain and Prussia formed this, and I call it a cooperative alliance, it's not a strict military alliance in the way we might think about it today. But Russia says, well, Britain and Prussia are getting together, the heck with that. That's even more of a reason for me not to fuss with those guys. And as a result, also, Austria says, Britain's walked away from us. We didn't think they gave us all that much support anyway, so maybe France is the better ally. Now, Russia ends up joining with France and Austria, but he's sort of, Russia's in and out of it. And then there are a whole bunch of other states that pick sides. So I'm not going to go into those details. But now what we have, and notice the timing, January, Treaty of Westminster, May, Convention of Versailles, that's an actual military alliance, war is declared. Now the conflict moves from North America to Europe. And because it moves to Europe, it becomes global in scope. This is not a world war in the sense that China joins in or India joins in. They are targets in various locations that I showed on a previous slide. But, what was that? Holy mackerel. Okay. Got gas? All right. Make sure you in Zoom land have muted your...
Yeah, they're all muted.
Okay. All right. So one of the key people who arrives in North America is this guy, Montcalm. He's an experienced officer, as was Descaux. The French are willing to commit, but they also are looking at the continent and they're saying that's where our greatest threats are. So our commitment to Canada, to New France, is going to be quite limited. We'll try to send some things there, But when push comes to shove, what matters is what's happening in Europe. Britain, on the other hand, begins to take another different attitude. And this is driven primarily by Newcastle and Pitt, who, although they didn't like each other, got together in order to establish a strategy for England. Pitt, in particular, had the greatest influence. This is Pitt the Elder, not Pitt the Younger. And what he indicates as the strategy is this: we're going to let surrogates fight on the continent. We'll fund them because we have the depths of resources in order to do that. In the meantime, our biggest targets are going to be taking the French out of North America, controlling the Caribbean region as best we can, and we will take whatever colonies we can grab in India, Indonesia, and even as far as the Philippines. That will make us a truly global empire. And the importance of doing it is this: we have the Navy to transport the resources and men far afield, where the other countries trying to defend these regions do not have that sufficiency. So this should be a relatively easy capture, all things considered. And on top of it, even if things go badly in Europe, and we ultimately have to come to some kind of treaty, we've got a lot of bargaining chips on the table that they don't have. So strategically, this is very important. But there's another part of this, and I don't know if this light works. Let me just check. Nope. Okay, doesn't matter there. I want to just cover something quickly, because there's another key feature that develops very quickly. Starts even with Braddock's arrival in the colonies, the English colonies, where he meets a lot of resistance, not just from the governors. The royal governors are kind of co-opted by Braddock, because Braddock's charge is that you are not just commander-in-chief of the military, but you have the political authority to demand from the governors that they follow your instructions. What does the royal governor have to do? Is he a dictator? Long established, over 100 years, there have been colonial legislatures. And over that 100 years, the colonial legislatures have worked with the governors in order to determine what they feel is best for that particular colony. They don't pay as much attention to what the Parliament in England wants. So as a political organization, while they understand foreign policy is handled through London, with all the conflicts on the peripheries, on the frontiers, where they've been subjected to conflicts for over 100 years, we're talking 150, basically, they're saying, we can decide what's best for us. You guys can't. So when Braddock starts wanting to get supplies, and he goes to the governors and he says, I need X, Y, and Z plus this many men, the governors turn to the legislatures, and the legislatures say, I'm not so sure. And that's why it took him more than a year to gather the supplies and the manpower for him to carry out his strategy. Now, think of the repercussions back in England. Braddock is sending the messages saying what he's doing. He's got to send regular reports, as do the governors of all the colonies. And what basically is the message? These colonists, all right, are just recalcitrant blah, 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 and we've had enough of this blah, 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 and so on. Well, what's the attitude in Parliament? We're in charge, tell those blah, blah, blahs to get their act together. And if we have to enforce our will, we will do that. We're the government, not those guys, all right? So you can begin to see the tensions beginning to rise up, where there's this increasing sense of independence in the colonies that's been growing slowly, but it is going to escalate through the effects of this conflict on North America. So, I mention all of this because the second key issue, as I already alluded to, are the strategic goals. France, as in the past, with the various conflicts that I've outlined in the other lectures, has lost territory to the British. For example, they lost Louisbourg previously. But once the treaty was signed, they got it back. So in part, their expectation is, well, New France is really not a great place. In fact, Voltaire called it a few acres of snow. Okay. They look at it and say, it's not quite a money pit, but, you know, the balance of trade has really not been all that great. We've had so much trouble as a result that we're not going to commit enormous resources, which I covered before. So their expectation is if we win on the continent, where we have a very strong army and we have powerful allies with Austria and Russia, for example, and a bunch of other principalities that are going to be on their side, they look at it and say, we win here, the Brits are going to have to give everything back anyway. Maybe we'll go back to status quo ante. So the great divergence is that Pitt is saying, we're going to have a global empire, which means we're not giving stuff back. If we get it, it's ours. And the other side is saying, well, when we get a negotiation, you'll give it back. Does that remind you of what's going on in Ukraine? No, keep it in mind. That's why these kinds of lessons permeate much of what we're doing today or what we see today, all right? The other part is that I think it is fair, though I usually don't like to do this, to lay blame, if you want to call it that, at the feet of the English government. They're driving this narrative. And because of the alterations in the alliances in Europe, they've set up a dynamic that almost with clarity on all sides is going to lead to war. Now, Montcalm is a very experienced general. He gets to Quebec, he goes down to Montreal, he takes troops down to Fort Frontenac, and he says, I am going to drive those pesky English out of Lake Ontario entirely. So what does he do? He attacks Fort Oswego. You can go up to that part of our state and visit the region. And what he does, as you'll see in the top right, is he establishes the first French position. Now, the difficulty that you can get in history is they'll read and say, this was a stupid arrangement of forts. Well, is it or not? The high ground is where Fort Ontario is. Fort Oswego is on low ground, and Fort George is on high ground. If you don't hold the high ground and a foreign force comes down and they get the high ground, you're done as far as Fort Oswego is concerned. So either you abandon the fort altogether or you fortify it, and that also means you have to have enough people, okay? Well, unfortunately, due to Shirley having to withdraw from this region and take troops back because he can't supply them all the way out there from Albany, is that it's a diminished force. So when the French arrive in this first position that you see, without too much effort, they take Fort Ontario. And when they occupy it, they have enough artillery that they can put up on this high ground and they can begin to bombard Fort Oswego. And during one of these bombardments, the common commander there is killed. The second French position is as they cross the river and come up, they can build siege lines which will lead up to Fort Oswego and take it. The now new commander looks around and says, we don't have the high ground, we don't have the men, we're getting pummeled by artillery, we have no expectation there will be any reinforcement, any relief force coming our way. All I'm going to do is end up getting people killed. So he surrenders. But Montcalm is so annoyed that he didn't put up a bigger resistance. He does not give him the honors of war, which include clear obligation of the winning side to protect those who have surrendered. It's a subtle difference, but it matters. So he's going to take the captives, he's going to return them back to Quebec, and then eventually they may end up in France or whatever. But what happens? The Native Americans, as been their mantra for a long time, we're here for loot and prisoners. And to be able to take home examples of our ability as warriors. So they kill a whole bunch of prisoners. Now, Montcalm is appalled. He's a European raised with traditional military force, and he has an expectation this isn't going to happen. He tries very hard to stop what he can. Eventually, they even ransom some of the prisoners, and it all gets into a mess. But again, now think of yourself as an English colonist. And you learn about this, because you are going to learn about it. This word spreads, right? You learn that when you surrender, your chances of surviving what is going to happen may be considerably reduced unless you get the honors of war, first of all. And again, as I've said many times before, the gloves are off. Okay? This is an example, and it's rather striking to look at this fort. That's how it looked, and the French are marching in, and the prisoners are marching out. Montcalm has a lot of supplies and artillery that he's gathered, but he's not going to stay here. He's basically going to head out. Now, interestingly, that's kind of the end of 1756. It takes a long time for these operations to unfold, and the distances that are involved are considerable. So many times, especially as you approach bad weather, the tendency is to go back where you have resources and supplies. And even there, such as Montreal or Quebec, Fort Frontenac is at the long end of a long supply line, which is already being interrupted by the British. You got to get back where there's food. You can get new clothing, you can rearm yourselves, you can train, and so on and so forth. That's why this shuts down quickly in 56. In 57, new operations, now the French feel they have the initiative, are going to unfold. One of the key ones, and if you've watched the movie, The Last of the Mohicans, which is interesting because in this particular event, I don't think there are any Mohicans there at all. They got pushed into Connecticut, so it's one of those bizarre stories. But anyway, the French again feel that what they need to do, much like the Confederacy against the Union in the Civil War, is all we need to do is hold the line. We don't need to conquer the colonies. It's impossible, first of all, not even feasible. But if we hold the line, then what's happening in Europe, because they're aware of it now, war's broken out. If things go the way the French would like them to go with Austria and Russia, major powers, then that's all we need to do. But how can we do that? Well, much like General Lee, you want to send your forces down into enemy territory, beat them up, right? And then you can go back to where you started, because now they've got a bloody nose and they're not going to be willing to come after you right away. So what happens? Montcalm gathers his troops, passes down Lake Champlain, goes now to Fort Carillon, which is what we call Fort Ticonderoga, just in case you weren't familiar with that. And from there, he's going to attack Fort William Henry. Now, when he does this, he clearly outnumbers the troops that are at Fort William Henry. And there's the Colonel Monroe, who's the British commander at the time, and they put up considerable resistance, even though the initial attacks wreck much of the outlying fortifications that are existing there. And as a result, Montcalm is willing to grant them the honors of war. You can march out with your weapons, unloaded. You can march out with your flags. You can bring one artillery piece with you when the time comes for you to leave. And all you have to do is head back to Albany. We're going to leave you alone. And you cannot return to the conflict for some period of time. I forget the duration. It might be 90 days, something like that. So that when Monroe surrenders, the Indians, as is their usual, say, what about us? We came down here, you're guaranteed, you loot and prisoners. So what do? They rush into the fort and they start taking all the stuff they can, because that's what they want to take back home. And in doing this, they enter the hospital and they kill the sick and wounded who were in the hospital. And they also started to dig up some graves, because they know that sometimes when you bury somebody, he's got something of value with him. Well, it turns out there was smallpox. Now, lest you think Europeans were immune to smallpox, you got that all wrong, all right? For decades, Europeans died of smallpox in North America, sometimes with devastating results. But the Native Americans, some of them get it, but they don't know they have it until they get back home. And when they get back home, it spreads. Now, Monroe protests to Montcalm and says, listen, you're supposed to stop that. Well, I tried, I can't. He says, all right, well, tomorrow morning we're leaving as you've told us. So they start out, and is depicted pretty well in the movie. The Native Americans who stayed said, more prisoners, more loot. Plus, they have weapons, but they're not loaded. So they attack the column. And again, numbers vary enormously. I'm not going to get into that question. Different people write about it in different ways. But the slaughter takes place. The yellow line shows where the encampment was, which Montcalm destroyed quickly. And then you'll see the size of the fort, which really isn't all that big, right? And the reason there was this encampment was they couldn't keep everybody in the fort. So once they retreated into there, everybody was stuffed. It just shows you how this was set up. And that is a blow up of the picture of Fort William Henry, just to give you an idea of the construction that Europeans were bringing to create these kinds of forts, based on somebody named Vauban, who was Louis XIV's major engineer, if I got that correct. Anyway, so here's a picture from an 1870 portrayal of a slaughter that's taking place. And if you come up here and look, well, it's not identical. It's pretty similar, right? And in addition, and this is not fanciful, in the top left, it's a mother trying to save her baby. And the Native Americans killed babies without any hesitancy, and sometimes boiled them up and ate them. There's a story by Alan Eckert describing that when some of the captives were being taken back, they literally were hungry, so they boiled a baby. Now that's not the British boiled baby, okay? This is for real. So it was witnessed by survivors who eventually ended up in France. The consequence of what happens at Fort William Henry, much as what happened at Fort Oswego, is reinforcing the brutality that is going to exist throughout the rest, basically, often of American history as Americans move west. This becomes part of the Europeans/English/American understanding of what happens when you deal with Native Americans, okay? But they also learned some other important lessons that I've outlined here, because the kind of tactics you used in Europe, remember, these are often European generals or people who have experience with the European military strategies and doctrine, are adapting, and they're going to adapt very quickly. So these are some of the things that they outline. Light gear, minimal baggage, stealth, use of terrain, single file, marksmanship, mobility. If you go out one road, come back a different road. Don't use the same road twice. That's a setup. Individual initiative. You're spread out more. We have to count on you to make certain kinds of decisions. These are small unit tactics. The commander can't try to navigate what's going on through forested areas, because remember, they don't have radios. They don't have cell phones. Personal weapons. It's not enough to carry a musket. You've got to have a knife, a tomahawk, maybe 2 pistols. You're going to be heavily armed even though you're traveling light. You're not going to carry much more than a blanket, maybe something to protect you from rain, but you're going to sleep on the ground, and we're going to have half of our force awake all the time. So you don't get surprised. And if you encounter a force when you're out there, you come back and tell us. Don't sit there and try to take them on. So these are just various things. The 360 awareness, fire discipline. Don't go shooting off in any direction. Pick your target, shoot at it. That's very different from standard European warfare. Be ready to fight at night. And it takes training. The point is that now what they're doing is they're getting very serious about their military obligations. And they're going to bring those provincials, even the militia, but certainly the regulars are all going to be brought up to snuff. We're going to create light units. And this is one of the most famous ones, Rogers Rangers. And he wrote a set of principles, 28 principles of how you're going to behave, the obligations you have, and the points of our training as we go ahead. Now, I'm going to stop here. George, I want you to come up. We can turn these front lights on and go from there. Thank you. George, do you want my microphone? Okay, I'll turn mine off.
Hello, everybody. It's always my pleasure to be back in front of you Lyceumers, so thank you very much. So in following up with what Michael's been talking about for a couple of weeks now, I've brought some of my little toys, as I always like to do, and I'll set this one up here, but I think it'll be out of the way. So Michael just finished sharing with you about personal weapons as opposed to just the musket. And so I've brought a bunch of those. I will share with you, he mentioned about 10,000 scalping knives. Well, there's one of the 10,000 scalping knives right there, just in case you're curious. But these started with stone, as we all know, and so I've brought this little gem. This should be very recognizable to you and me because it's basically a chunk of shale. We have a lot of shale in this neck of the woods, and so you can come on up when I'm done or afterwards and you can test, but just be a little careful. It's amazing how sharp this will be, it can be. The opposite of that would be just this chunk of stone. And when I give talks, I often share this with people that they say, well, that's not sharp enough to do anything. Well, you're right, it's not, but it'll, number one, knock you out. But more importantly, this was designed this way because how did they cut down a tree? Well, they built a fire around the base of the tree, and as the fire raged, they would come in with a blunt stone like that, and they would chip away at the char of the base of the tree, which would ultimately, boom, the tree would come down. And by the way, how did you make a tree canoe? Same thing. You get a big enough tree, you start a fire along the length of it, and as it chars up, you begin to chop away at the char. And believe it or not, I was recently at a fort at number 4 up in the border between Vermont and New Hampshire, and they've got a couple of canoes that they have found in the Connecticut River there. And sure enough, that's how they made it. But these come in all different shapes and sizes. You can come on up later. But it was interesting because the English and the French ultimately realized that the Indians were using their hatchets not only as a hatchet, but as a hammer. So guess what? They ended up making a head that has a hammer tail to it. So now they could have a dual purpose without busting up the hatchet itself. And you ask yourself, well, how did they make these heads, by the way? And if you come on up and take a look at this example, by the way, this is called a squaw axe. It's small. So this would have been used in the home of the Indians, not necessarily as a weapon. But if you come on up and take a look at this, if I turn it up, you'll notice that there's a split right in the front here, the top of this. And that's because this started off as a single bar of steel, yay long. And through the process of heating and hitting, heating and pounding, they were able to wrap this around and create this hatchet. So again, come on up and you can see the line right there, which was the original separation, but they brought the two pieces together. This you might recognize because this is what they used to chop the heads off in Europe. Not this size, this is too small. So again, this is French. Again, we have the continent being represented here. This little gem, it's pretty exciting. This is actually a smoking pipe. We like to think of it as the peace pipe. That's more of a Western Indian thing than Eastern. But this shape, actually, if you turn it like this, was typical of the officer spears, halberds, that the Continental armies had at this particular time. Even into the American Revolution, you had these. But basically, the folks that were trading with the Indians realized that anything that was exciting, that was different, would bring more loot in the form of beaver pelts or other pelts. So sure enough, the blacksmiths began to create heads like this, and because again, they would be worth more money. Now again, I tell you that this is a smoking one, and it is. You've got this bowl on the backside for the tobacco. This little nut on the top would be how you would open that up and clean it out. And if you come on up and take a look at it, there's the hole right there. So you're able to smoke this guy with the tobacco that was being traded by the English and the French. Michael already showed you this gem. This is quite the weapon. Interestingly, I found this at an antique shop in England, of all places. But again, if you notice, and come on up afterwards, this is all hand shaved, this piece, with this burl head here. And sure enough, they just cut and cut until they were able to get that chunk of steel in there. And on the back side, you'll see the back pin of the iron piece that's holding it in place. So again, quite the weapon. You're going to get hit one way or the other, but this had no intent other than to be hit and to be destroyed. And then this is a reproduction. Most of those are original, by the way. So this is a reproduction, but again, just very typical of what the Indians would form. Now, in captivity, meaning museums, there are examples of these that are from this period. And they actually have a 1 to 2 inch piece of iron sticking out of this ball end here. Again, whole intent was to knock your enemy down and immobilize them, kill them, whatever way it went. Yes, sir?
Is that one piece of wood carved?
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah, they wouldn't have had a way, even if they had made the ball separately, they wouldn't have really had a way to. So,
It looks like a shillelagh.
okay.
Did the Indians have iron and or steel
Well, sure, because,
before the settlers came?
oh, no. If you go way back, 1607, 1608, 1609, Henry Hudson and so on and so forth, the various, they're the ones that ultimately, once the whites begin to arrive in North America, by the time of the French and Indian War, the Indians are really quite sophisticated in their weaponry because why? They're getting it in trade process. You have to remember, and the reason the Mohawk River has the exploration and the growth that it does, just like the Hudson, is simply the waterways. But again, the Indians have been very, very active trading with the whites and the French certainly. As a matter of fact, I brought this map. You can come on up and take a look at it afterwards. This map is representing 1754, and it'll show you the various tribes. But again, this is all activity, so there's plenty of weapons, plenty of iron that is now available to the Indians. So you're all going to look at this and ask me what this is. This is not a weapon. I put it out just because of its curiosity facts. Whenever I take this to a show, I always get more questions about this, so I'll answer your questions right now as opposed to individually. So I bought this item years ago at an antique show in Schoharie, New York. Now, Schoharie, New York is not far, pretty much in the middle of the Indian activity back in these days and into the American Revolution. And there was a lady there that had some nice Indian stuff. I wish I could go back and find that same day again because I'd have bought other things. But this was the one item that it struck me. And so speaking of iron, the Indians would never have gotten rid of any metal. There was always use for it. So if you come on up and take a look at this, this is just a very simple piece of sheet metal. It is sharp, so it is a cutter, not a scraper. If it were a scraper, it would be sharp on one edge. Scraping the inside of hides, for example, would be an example of a scraper. So this is a cutter. It's all hand done. You can take a good look at it. This is obviously the handle back here. I don't know why this is like this. The story that I will share with you is that this was designed to pull out, forgive me ladies, pull out the guts of an animal. If you imagine a deer hanging and you would have to pull out the guts. And then because of this curve, we often know today that knives have a curve. So I'm believing that this would have been a cutter. And so secondarily, this upper part would have given you additional leverage to cut the meat. But it is very interesting because, again, if you come up and look at the construction, they were able to cut just a thin piece, a line in this piece of wood to then insert, and this blade goes into this piece, probably about a good inch to secure it. I don't know how old it is. It's got some certain age, but it certainly has survived. This particular knife looks different than the other knife, the knife that's the scalping knife. This is what's known as a French voyageur's knife. Why the French this particular style? Well, you have to go to France and see if you find something that has this particular shape, but it is unique that way. Again, a very early knife, again using shale that's sharpened and then just put into a handle, but this would have been the earlier method that the Indians would have used for preparation of food. Okay, on this side, I've brought you a bunch of powder horns. So again, when we talk about the muskets of the time, it takes powder and flint, and steel, and lead ball, obviously. This gem here, when we talk about taking forts, as Michael has been sharing, this is a cannon powder horn. And so basically the way this works is this backside unscrews, which is how they can put the powder in. And again, if you think about the type and the size of the cannon that was used in that period, you would have this lever which would open, and so you could reach up to the top, because there's no such thing as fuses back in the day for the cannons, okay? The cannons, and if you watch that movie, Last of the Mohicans, and you watch the sequence where the French cannons are firing at the British fort, you might recall a sequence where after they fire the cannon, a chunk of sheepskin was put over the top breech of the cannon. That was to cover the vent hole so that there was no air that could get into the breech to help feed the embers that might be left. And so just like the Civil War, you had to go in and swab the breech to make sure there was no embers in there before you put the next bag of powder in there. But at this particular time, unlike the Civil War, which they had a fuse and a string that you pulled to actuate the fuse, you had to prime the cannon by pouring powder into that touch hole. And then you simply come, and there's an item called a forestock that's got a lit piece of rope to it, and you would touch off the powder, boom, firing the cannon. And as soon as the cannon fired, you'd put that sheepskin back up over that touch hole to keep any air from going in. Otherwise, these come in all different shapes and sizes. This is some of the earliest type of country crafts. And that's why I brought all of these, because there's no one set methodology other than you need a tip to pour it in. Now, unlike the cannon one, the other ones do not have a end piece that you open up and pour into. So they would have simply rolled up a piece of paper as a funnel to then fill the horn. But again, this is simply comes from Macau, and the way that this worked is they would simply take these and they would soak them and soak them and soak them and get them soft, and then they would take their knife and they would scrape them down to thin them out. And the reason for that was so that they could look into the light and they could see how much powder was in there. But then you get into the scrimshawing process, and I don't have any scrimshawed other than this. And this, by the way, is a reproduction, but a wonderful one. So they would have had these, and this would have been filled with brandy or rum would have been very typical. That's why this one's called the Devil's Brew. But again, remember, water wasn't good back in those days, so it was not uncommon for all the soldiers to have this. But you can come on up and see an example of the scrimshaw. Now, the reason I don't have any scrimshawed original, these are all original from this period and into the early 1800s. The reason I don't have those is because they have been faked. And unless you really, really, really know your stuff, or you've got the ability to really look very, very carefully at the scrimshawing, it's just too crazy. And naturally, a scrimshawed horn is going to be much, much more expensive. And so I've stayed away from them just because I can't guarantee that I'm buying, spending $500 to $5,000. But I recommend you all go to Fort Ticonderoga because they have the most fabulous original collection of period scrimshawed horns you could ever see. And it is just spectacular. Plus the fact the fort is finished and it's in wonder shape. So again, just a quick note, how am I dressed? I'm dressed as a 1750s colonial militia or provincial troops, okay? Yes, a lot of us, and by the way, per Michael's talk, 50,000 of us Americans fought with the British, which is partially why Britain was able to do what they did in this country, because they had an army here in this country. They didn't have to support us to the full degree that they had to worry about Europe, because they had 50,000 Americans that were willing to come to arms against the French. But again, so the waistcoat that I'm wearing is longer. This is not uncommon. By the time of the American Revolution, the waistcoat had been cut to much shorter because they didn't have extra length. And I don't have these long leggings simply because it's starting to snow out. I have it because at that particular time, the woods are not cleared. Now, at the time of the American Revolution, these are no longer typical. They're about half that size because there's been so much development in that 15-year period that the woods are not as full and there as much as they were this particular time. If you think about Braddock's march across Pennsylvania, you can imagine what they had to deal with. And this was their way to deal with the briars and prickers and everything that would have ripped their pants and ripped their legs to shreds. And so they, yes, but, and this would probably help with that, but they more were interested in the snakes to kill them and eat them than they were about, yes, sir.
Okay, I have a powder horn. I'm going to load my musket.
Yes.
How do I determine just the right amount of powder? I don't want to overfill it.
Yep.
I don't want to underfill it. And there doesn't seem to be any metering device on.
Not on those, but hanging from my apparatus, if I were in full gear, I would have a little bone measuring device for 40, 50, or 60 or 70 grains of powder. And so, Bob, that's a very good question, because again, you have to think in terms of the time it took to load and fire a rifle versus a smoothbore weapon. So the soldiers that are shooting smoothbore weapons have pre-made cartridges with them, okay, that are loaded with the powder. But if I'm shooting a rifle that I brought from home, because that's the only way I would have gotten a rifle, I have exactly the right measuring device available, and it's hanging from my kit. Yeah.
I'm going
But
to.
that's why it took a minute plus to load a rifle versus 15 to 20 seconds for a musket.
I'm going to let them have a break
Yep.
for a few minutes, but please come up, continue to ask questions. Tom, why don't you leave it on record so that if people are asking George questions or me, then we can provide answers and people can listen if they wish from Lyceum. But please don't hesitate. Come up, take a look, feel what these things are like.
jacket for warmth or protection or what?
No, because this is what
identify you?
this is what a gentleman would wear.
Oh, not out in, not a fight.
Oh, yeah, that too.
And you don't have to lay down to put it in.
So back in those days,
About 15 years
again,
ago,
it
my
was
husband
very
and I
typical
went to
hat
the
and
house,
vest. was
and they
very
had
typical.
built the floor.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Well, it may not still be there, but
What I don't
they
have
had
on is a regimental coat or a heavier coat, especially this time of
so
year.
the Canadian
But even in the
government
summer, this
of
would have been
Scotia
very common.
hired
Do
them
those
to
button,
rebuild
or do you
Lewisburg.
have to just?
Wow.
I don't know whether he's going to be using that, but
We're very bureaucratic.
that'll help a lot.
Well, this
Yes,
fell apart.
yes.
Really?
I slipped them on, but
Thank you.
Oh, definitely keep that in mind. I've not been up in that part of the world, and
This is worse
Gina
than
and I
getting a
have
kid in
talked
the
about that
snowstorm.
as a possibility of what to do.
It's near Sydney and.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd probably fly up and rent a car, because it's about a 10-hour drive or more. I just don't know if I want to drive that much. Unless I visit family and they feed me, and give me a place to stay. That was an eye-opening thing. It basically describes how the cartels gain control and can take over territories. And they're taking over tribal lands. They basically are telling the tribal leaders, oh, we'll give you all this money. And then the next thing you know is, no, we're not giving you the money anymore. What do you want to do about it? I know where your kids live.
So when they spring break,
Really? Yeah, it's really pretty amazing. Oh, you don't? They're excellent. I have to say, I mean, there's a whole bunch that they do. And I have probably now half a dozen of them. I don't know if they have the advertisements here.
They have them in the regular magazine.
Yeah. Yeah, this lists some of the ones, if you want to look at it or whatever. Yeah, that tells you a little bit about the quarterlies. But think of it as a small island nation. How do you support an economy with a burgeoning population? Well, you got to displace the population. That's part. But then as you discover all this wealth in North America, remember also they had cut down nearly all their trees. They had to import them from Norway, but Norway has not got a lot of trees, especially for the kind of masts and shipbuilding you need. You need big, big trees.
There used to be a very nice display square shop. Desmond owns now. It went north on. In fact, it was
And then they did the.
And we woke up. Already it's going to be a great day.
This area right here, southeast Westport, Westport, right on the border.
Let me know when you want me to ring the bell.
People I knew, they said, yeah, they used to have the trees at the ground would come and mark for main mass.
Fort Niagara was going to establish. I grew up in Buffalo and as a child, we were contractually obligated
I got a card saying it was the best pancake ever because of me, and I just thought, is he making this up? This seems a little too kind. Thanks for the kind words, but get me to come back.
So what happens next? 1758, well, it looked as though the French were ascending.
Your mic's not.
Check your mic.
Got it. Better?
Yes.
Okay. 1758, looks as though the French were ascendant, but now the tide is really beginning to turn. As I talked about, the defensive strategy used by the French puts them in a position where the initiative continues to lie with the British. And as more resources are gathered, and as George mentioned, up to 50,000 colonists are become part of the British forces. They're going to take on the French, something which the French and their colonists can't possibly match, begins to shift the balance. And now, especially with the arrival of some reasonably competent, and I don't say that too critically, but this is part of what we have to deal with reasonably competent generals, now the shift becomes considerable. So in 1758, Abercrombie is sent to be put pretty much in charge of things. And as you'll notice, you'll see that much of the strategy that occurs in his direction is related to the same places where Shirley and William Johnson had tried to operate before. And they use the valley structures. He has Broadstreet, who is a subordinate of his, and Broadstreet is going to follow that same road that Shirley used, and he's going to go back up to the destroyed Fort Oswego. When Montcalm was there, he just wanted to wreck the fort and take all the supplies he could, including artillery, out of there, because he didn't want to have a permanent presence there. It didn't matter to him. But instead, he reinforced Fort Frontenac, which truly guarded the entry point to the St. Lawrence. And the second issue was that Abercrombie himself was going to go up and try to drive the French out of their holdings at Fort Carillon and also Fort St. Frederick. He was going to also have another campaign that was going to head up again, reinforce the what Monckton had been able to achieve by taking Fort Beausejour and cutting off Louisbourg from a land connection, not shown on this map, and possibly take Louisbourg, which would have great implications for cutting off access for the French to the St. Lawrence at all, would isolate Quebec and Montreal. And if these initiatives were all successful, there would be a three-pronged approach which could lead up and eventually take Montreal and Quebec and destroy the French holdings. Remember, that was the goal of the government in England. We want the French gone. We want them defeated. Well, the British strike at Fort Carillon. And in going up there, as is the case, the French are on the defense, but this is where Abercrombie makes some serious tactical errors. And as a result of the fighting that takes place outside of Fort Carillon, basically the British are defeated. So in a short thing, the real issue for the Brits is that although they're defeated, they still have the manpower, whereas the French just can't replace their losses. And also, Abercrombie and others are gaining considerable experience in dealing with the colonies and how to fight and gather resources and get their logistical trains all in proper order. I show this for the following reason. Notice the number of British at 15,000. This was a number you never saw in North America. Through all of the time that we've talked about, 150 plus years, nowhere near did a force ever reach this number. And notice the difference between regular troops at 6,300 and militia and provincials at 9,000. Now, in my last lecture, I also mentioned this point. Indian auxiliaries, maybe 500. Now, remember I showed you the demographics and the shrinking population of Native Americans. But more and more, especially as I showed in the adaptation of British forces to using light troops and rangers and other people who could replace the Indians, but would be under better discipline and control to the military hierarchy. Remember what Montcalm was struggling with and why he really disliked, if not hated, having to have Native Americans work with him is there was no discipline that he could exert. It was all negotiation. But here the dynamics are changing considerably. The Native Americans played less and less a role in what's going on. And the learning of lessons in how to fight in these kinds of conditions still are strengthened by having a military hierarchy which has orders sent down from the top, but understanding by the surrogates as to how they're going to behave and respond. The French at Fort Carillon are severely outnumbered. But because they're in a defensive situation and Abercrombie screws up the attack, and give him some credit for trying, the losses still are there. This just shows that, and now it's called Fort Ticonderoga only because. What the purpose of this slide is not to just show you that the fort here at the tip of this peninsula, but that Montcalm actually went out to meet him in the open field, but with defensive, what are called field works. And rather than try to get around the flank and hold the French troops in their fortifications and get around the flank, he just hits them head on. And that just doesn't work. The second part is Mount Defiance, Mount Independence. These are high ground. If Abercrombie had got up here, he would have been able to shell with artillery. And this is what actually happened in the Revolutionary War, for some of you who are familiar with that. So if you go to Fort Ticonderoga, look where it is and then look around and see what's there. And as the British used to say, where a goat can go, a man can go. And where a man can go, artillery can go. Okay. Abercrombie retreats, but it's not a rout. The French are unable and really don't have the capacity to pursue. So he's able to keep his force intact. He's taken a beating, but he's going to retreat back, but this is not the end of it. The second part that I mentioned is he had a second arm that was going to go up and try to take Louisburg. And this siege takes place over these weeks, roughly 6 weeks or so, 8 weeks. The reason I show this slide is the following. If you look back on the first time the Brits took Louisburg, they landed in almost exactly the same place. And they followed the same kind of path to cut off Louisburg. And the French ships here are actually caught because the British Navy, as you see in these red positions down below, well outnumbers the French. And the French Navy doesn't have the capacity to seriously hinder what's going to be the siege works that end up taking Louisburg. Remember also, as I said before, the French could not commit the resources to hold on to these places. The best they could hope for was to make it excruciatingly painful for the British. But once you develop a siege, and there's particular techniques you use to do this, you basically know unless you can get support and supplies, you're doomed. And because the British controlled all the lines of communication and supply, they could keep their forces well supplied and keep the French from getting anything. This just again shows the final steps to the capture. Who's here? Amherst. Oh, is that something? We have a college. And with him is a younger man named Wolfe. Wolfe takes part in this and distinguishes himself, and this is important because of what I've written down on the last bit. He's given overall command to attack Quebec. Remember, this is a stepping stone. Take Louisburg, and then we cut off the St. Lawrence so the French can't do anything about it. And then we can move up the St. Lawrence, and if we're successful, as we'll see from what Bradstreet did, we're going to be able to come down the St. Lawrence, and together we'll be able to catch the French in a vice. Notice also the honors of war are denied. It's not the Drucourt did not put up a decent defense. What had happened at Fort Oswego? Montcalm said, you didn't defend well enough, so you're not getting the honors of war. So pure and simple, this is retaliation. Now, what does this mean? Well, fortunately for the French, there aren't really any Native Americans here who are going to kill and pillage. So what happens is they're treated as prisoners of war and they're sent back to England. Okay. The second arm that Abercrombie had set up was the same thing as I mentioned before, only this time Bradstreet is going to move up when he comes to Fort Oswego, which had been destroyed when Montcalm took it and left. He redesignated this area as a big supply place. Fort Stanwix, by the way, as you'll see here, plays a significant role in the American Revolution, and it's been a reconstructed fort. It's well worth visiting. It's really pretty neat. But what he does is he establishes a supply base, and then he attacks up to take Fort Frontenac. Now, because of the way the French military had to construct itself and the primary concerns they had in North America, Montreal and Quebec are the keys. So they didn't have much in the way of defense at Fort Frontenac. They did have a couple of ships there, and they thought that would be sufficient to prevent a naval force from coming up and taking it. It was not. So Bradstreet conducts a very smart attack, takes Fort Frontenac, and now what happens? The St. Lawrence is closed. All the French settlements to the west have no communication back to Quebec and Montreal. Louisbourg has fallen. St. Lawrence is cut off. No supplies, no reinforcements coming from France going to get to Quebec and Montreal. This just gives a very quick idea of the plan, and it shows the major magazines, the main fort that you see here in A. And I just point this out to just show the idea of the head of the St. Lawrence down here. So having a fort here with this narrow segment is easy to interdict traffic that's trying to travel by water. This is just an example, again, of blowing up things, which you like to do when you're done with it, and capturing French ships, and blowing things up is fun, right? But what he's going to do initially is he's not going to stay there. With more powerful establishment at Fort Oswego, he can have, with his naval force, continue to interdict and patrol the headwaters of the St. Lawrence. And basically, there's no particular French fleet in Lake Ontario. Even though they have Fort Niagara, they don't have anything that's really going to contest with what Bradstreet is able to put together. Captures supplies, furs, returns back. Now, what else is going on? Well, the British remember Braddock and what happened to him. And they recognize that the French fort, Fort Duquesne, current Pittsburgh, still is a major hold on the Ohio Valley. But because of the numbers that they were able to raise in North America, they now can also send another force back out to take Fort Duquesne. It doesn't have the same strategic implications of necessarily heading north and going up into Fort Niagara region and cutting off that part of the New Canada and so on from the west. But it's partly designed to control the forks of the Ohio. Remember, about any bargaining positions and driving the French out, and partly to make up for the losses that they had suffered under Braddock's things. So you have this Forbes Road. Now, it doesn't show us things, but it does show Allegheny Mountain, Laurel Hill, Chestnut Ridge. These are all areas you have to traverse in order to get up there. It's fairly successful, but notice who's there going along with it. He'd been there before, a couple of times. George Washington. Highest rank attained by an American. Also interesting, all right? So he wasn't completely inexperienced when the American Revolution comes around. The advance force is caught by the French again. They take a beating, but the French realize they can't hold. So what happens is they destroy the fort and then head north. And they've basically turned this over to the British.
Hey, Michael.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, but
A little piece about Forbes, the commanding officer, he's dying. And when they get to, I think, 9-10 miles, they hear the explosion of the fort. At that point, he's basically bedridden. And so they take him to the fort to see it. But then when he returns back, he dies 30 days later in Philadelphia.
yeah.
And so because he was a physician, and so he knew that he was dying, but he at least got to the fort, saw its destruction before he died.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you for that. 1759, Anna Mirabilis, the year of miracles. The tide now is full flood in British favor. And as a result, the various operations that are going to take place, and Abercrombie is replaced, are going to really signaled the death knell of French control in North America. Now, I mentioned about Wolfe. He's a young man. He also is in ill health much of the time that he's involved in this. So it's an interesting element that in spite of the way we might see portraits of them, full and vigorous kind of thing, we forget that some of these people, like Forbes, were truly deathly ill when they were conducting as commanders various campaigns. It's an extraordinary physical feat when you think about how many of us, and I include myself, I get a bad cold, I'm going to go to bed for 24 hours and try to beat that thing off, right? These guys, not even close, right? Oh, sorry, wrong way. Get myself going the right direction. So what are the issues that take place? There's a whole series of offensives, once again, that are going to be constructed. The British offenses are going to focus, they've already taken Oswego, but now they're going to go to see about taking Niagara. They're going to drive the French completely out of Lake Ontario, and they're going to open the water route all the way up to Champlain and use Lake Champlain to bring them directly north, which will put them very close to Montreal and give them another prong they can use to attack Quebec. And they do this by capturing Fort Carillon. They rename it Ticonderoga, and they destroy that other French fort that I'll mention, which is partway up on the west coast of Lake Champlain, Fort Frederick. So they're beginning to pull a lot of people together. And this slide just shows some of the dates of things that are going on. You're not going to get questioned on it. Major attacks. 2 successful operations. The French are completely on the defensive. They can do nothing more than react the best they can to what they're getting from the British. One of the main operations you'll see, again, is up the Mohawk to Fort Oswego. It's a decent place now. Bradstreet had rebuilt it, reconstructed it. It was a major place so they could cut off the entry to the St. Lawrence. And now a surrogate, Prideaux, is going to head for Fort Niagara. And when he does go there, and Robert, you had mentioned it, Gene and I visited a Fort Niagara, which is on the American side, and you were alluding that there was another Fort Niagara on the British side. Is that correct?
I'm trying to picture, but I was like 8 years old, so it's not.
Oh, well, all right. So your memory is gone. This Fort Niagara is on the American side, and you can visit it today, and there's an interesting pamphlet that they have that describes its history, and you can walk through it. It's really a great visit, I have to say. So they, by July, have captured that. Now look at the implications. That completely chops up New Canada, the French territories, into various segments. They can't help each other. There's no way to shift in any degree of rapidity resources from one place to another. You are on your own. The other major attack is the one that's going to occur by Amherst heading up north. Now, let me just go back. He gets up to Fort Ticonderoga, and again, what's happened? Montcalm has recognized, go back here, has recognized that he can't really hold this area anymore. He doesn't have the resources, that the numbers coming at him are just too much. So he has to fall back continually. And as he does so, he knows that Montreal and Quebec are the 2 major targets that the British are going to attempt to take. So Amherst gets up, wants to establish a firm base. So when he gets to Fort Carillon, he needs that as a major supply base, because the next step from his perspective is to keep driving straight north, clear the French completely out of Lake Champlain. Then it's not that long a trip to get to the St. Lawrence. So he's got to prepare for that, but it all takes time. There's nothing fast happening with all of this. Meanwhile, Wolfe is given charge to go take Quebec. And remember the importance of the British Navy. You can pick up a whole bunch of troops and you don't have to march overland. You can navigate up the St. Lawrence and you can establish yourself well enough to besiege Quebec. And if Quebec falls, then New France is done. It's completely gone. So what happens? Now I show this because the east is to your right. The green that you see there shows the St. Charles River, which has some importance in how this Quebec is going to be attacked and how the French try to defend. And the blue is where Quebec is itself. This line that I'm outlining here has some potential for landing, but it's very limited. And all through here, it's very cliff-like. So there isn't much opportunity for the Brits to use this area and come across. And if they get here and they begin to come in this direction, they've got the river that they have to cross. And rivers are always a major problem. It gives the defender enormous advantage. Because how are you going to get across the river? You're going to swim? That's not going to work. You're going to build a bridge? Yeah, but they're going to shoot at you in the process, so that's going to be tough. You're going to bring boats up? Yeah, you can do that, but again, you're targets. So it makes it very difficult. But because this land is somewhat low ground and there's high ground behind it, the thought might be the Brits might land here. Yes, they might be able to be shot at by the fort, but you get here, establish yourself, get up on high ground, put your artillery up here, and then you can force a crossing. So what did the French do? They build fieldworks and they staff it so that the Brits aren't going to have an easy time. This isn't Omaha Beach, but it's tough. So you don't like to land against opposition. This is just another example of it that shows where the earthworks are, all along here. Wolfe comes up and he camps well to the east, but over time he sends forces down to establish on the, call it the New York side, on the south side of the St. Lawrence, another camp. And he's going to put batteries up here which can bombard the fort itself. But this is still a difficult time. And on top of it, the main issue is that, remember, Wolfe is really sick. But there's another problem for Wolfe. He has jumped command over a number of other more senior people, and he's not exactly a nice person. In fact, some of his subordinates think that all he's interested in is self-glorification, and Wolfe, from their perspective, is perfectly willing to die in a glorious death in combat. He doesn't want to die while he's sick, all right? There's no glory in that. So they're concerned that what he's going to do is try to launch his attacks across this area, taking a beating, getting himself killed, and dying a glorious death. Well, Wolfe is a little smarter than that, but he's also not telling his subordinates what his plans are. All right? There are a lot of generals who have behaved that way. Montcalm is the defender. And remember, Montcalm is very experienced, but he also has trouble with his superior. And the disagreement is this: Vaudreuil wants to have the raids, keep pummeling the settlements, distract the British, make them spread their forces out, don't let them consolidate anywhere. Whereas Montcalm's idea is, listen, this is a fight to the finish, and the only way to fight to the finish is to meet them head on, conventional fighting against conventional fighting. I'm going to consolidate my forces, I'm going to defend Quebec, but when the time comes, we're going to go meet the British head on. It's the only way to assure ourselves a modicum of chance of ultimate victory, and hopefully the war will end in Europe. Wolfe, as I said, disliked by his subordinates, and the first attempts that were made on that line that I showed you didn't work. So what happens? A path is discovered up the cliffs, and I'm going to go back here for a moment, over here, that leads up to a relatively flat area, which is named after a local farmer, Abraham. It's called the Fields of Abraham, all right? This is not a reference to Father Abraham. They get across the river, they sneak up, and it's done during the night. So think about, there's no clear path to you that you know about, all right? You've got somebody who's going up ahead trying to figure out how to get up these cliffs, gets up to the top, and they find a very small French outpost. And they're able to get enough guys up there. Look how he's helping them by pulling them up with a rifle. All right, grab, hold, and pull. Look how narrow that path is. You fall off here, it's, you're gone. Better not shout on the way down, because you have to do this silently, all right? And that is, again, another part of the training, because with your force going up, you have to make sure there's no clatter from things bouncing against each other. You have to muffle everything. They get up there, they drive off that small French outpost. They actually, as I used the phrase before, where a goat can go, a man can go, where a man can go, an artillery can go. So they bring up a couple of small cannon. And they're able to establish themselves out in the field, and the defenders, Montcalm and the defenders in Quebec, say, uh-oh, we're facing a siege again. And one of the things that isn't clear, although you see what looks like lines of fortifications, is part of this west wall of Quebec is actually quite weak. Montcalm doesn't know how much artillery they have. He only knows they got up there. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that once you have a cliff and you have guys up on top, you can find ways to bring heavier cannon up over time. And once you have heavy cannon here, you can pummel Quebec into practically nothing. So what is Montcalm's choice? Stay in Quebec, wait for what appears to be, and what he knows to be, in a sense, the inevitable outcome, only trying to buy time, or if he can muster his forces and meet the British head on and defeat them, then that will preserve Quebec. That will stymie the British from making any real progress. So this is how it's set up. In addition, word has been sent to Montreal, where there are some French forces, and the order is, come up behind the British, get moving, get up here, and we will catch them in a vice. So if I can hold them or even defeat them, they have no way to get out of here. It's a cliff, right? How many people can you take in single file down that path that I showed you coming up? So it's a real risk that Wolfe has taken, because if he loses, then he's in a really bad place. So again, how do you manage? As the attacks unfold, the French are driven back. They have a number of French units, but they also have militia, and they have poorly trained people, and the lines begin to break. And as the lines break, two things happen. Wolfe is shot, and within a short period of time, he's going to die on the battlefield. I like this because I'm very interested in this individual right here. He's looking at him as though, what happens now? But more interested in what kind of a death is he going to have? I mean, it's really more just curiosity. It's not sympathy. And I'm not taking anything away from him. It's just interest. You're looking at this guy with your hand on your chin. It's like the thinker in native dress. I wonder what's going to happen now. But what about on the French side? Well, Montcalm gets shot. When he's shot, the French morale collapses. Montcalm dies as well. So the two senior commanders at Quebec die in this engagement. But the city walls are weak, the morale has collapsed. It's either Levi or Levis, I'm never quite sure the French pronunciation. Levis is coming up, but he arrives way too late. It's not going to be helpful. New France is basically conquered except for one final foray. And this is an attempt of Lévis to try to regain Quebec, and he's just too weak. So they have a battle of sorts at Saint Foy. The British actually are driven back a bit, but it doesn't matter because there's no way the French are going to be able to take over. So here is just showing, in a sense, the final sets of battles that are taking place, and the British have continued to advance up Champlain, as I mentioned. Now they're able to come down from Quebec, they're able to come up from Frontenac, and they come to Montreal, which basically has no defense. Basically, there's nothing left other than just surrender. Now, what happens now is basically the fighting in North America is over. Yes, there's some fighting that occurs, but in comparison to the narratives that I've taken you through so far, it really doesn't matter anymore. Because what matters now is what's happening on the global picture. So I mention this not to run through a bunch of slides very quickly, but I am going to do some of it just to give you a sense of it, is that the fighting in Europe is very intense. Interestingly, if you look at distances, the distances are much shorter than they are in North America. Is that me? No, okay. I didn't bring my phone. Okay, can't be guilty. And this is just to show what the empires of the world were roughly in 1750. You all set? Okay. Give you an idea.
Somebody's got on mute on their side, you're getting feedback.
Yes,
In
I
Zoom
noticed.
land, somebody's not muted.
Okay. All set. Okay.
Oh, they are.
Yep, thanks, Bob. So this just gives you an idea. Now, the reason I show this in part is notice how much territory falls to the Brits. Okay? They've actually gone all the way to Manila. They've taken places in India that you see as listed as British colonies. They are now global. That old idea, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because no matter where you are, there's a British presence. And this is where it starts. The other important part is that now, with the loss of France's control, England now says, and this is one of the interesting dynamics of trying to understand what it meant to have a European presence in North America, is the British basically say, we control everything up to the Mississippi River. Now, nobody asked the Native Americans about that, right? Because that's not how things worked in Europe. when you sent a force somewhere and you claimed that land for your monarch, your king, what the natives had to say about it didn't matter one whit, because your concern as a European power was you didn't want another European power coming in and trying to take that, because you wanted access to the resources that it offered. So if you look at South America, remember that Portugal and Spain went through that together. And I think it was the Pope who actually settled the conflict and gave much of the Spanish territories that you see on this map to Spain, and the area of Brazil and other areas to Portugal. Said, listen, just, all right, you have that, just stop, okay? Stop fighting each other, okay? But the indigenous populations everywhere had little to say about it. And when they did try to say something about it, as we've talked about in the last 150 years of colonial, American colonial history, is that when conflicts got violent, the superior technology generally won out. There'd be back and forth, but ultimately the resources that could be brought through global trade from the home country would settle the issue in favor of the home country. I show this slide for the following reasons. When the war finally concluded, right, there were a lot of changes that took place even on the European continent. And these particular changes become such a hodgepodge that over the next 50 plus years, getting into the 1800s, who are we going to see rise up? Napoleon and the French Empire. And then in the next 50 years, we're going to see the consolidation eventually of Germany so that it becomes a unified country, basically 1870, okay? And from then on, we're dealing with a different trajectory into history. It's been covered in other lectures. You can look it up. So the point is this. When people say this is the First World War, it's really the first war fought over the entirety of the globe with considerable intensity. But the importance of that is just to demonstrate that the fighting that occurred in Europe primarily and in North America with the elimination of French control, that now Europe and North America become the prime sources of energy that's going to drive the narrative that exists throughout the next 300 years or so. On top of it, there has been an enormous financial cost that Great Britain has taken on. And this financial cost has to have a return on investment, okay? On the other hand, you're getting your resources, yes, from India, you can get some from the Far East, but your prime source of resources, your prime source of trade in your favor is from North America. And so the British government, in many ways, very understandably, having already recognized how difficult the colonists are to deal with, that they just won't kowtow to the central government, saying, we have to do things which are going to force you to pay for this. We need that balance of trade back in our favor. And on top of it, when you consider all the resources the colonies / colonists put on the line, they're saying, yes, we are British, but more and more we are Americans, comma, British. It's not even hyphenated. We have established ourselves and our independence of judgment and direction for the course of our colonies, each separately at this point. But very quickly, there's going to be a Continental Congress. Pretty soon, you see this level of independent thinking rising up saying, wait a minute, you guys back 3,000 miles away can't keep telling us what to do. Now, the Brits committed great resources, and you'd only think a little bit of gratitude would be coming their way. It isn't going to happen. The message there in part also is what we see throughout the world today. You do something for me that benefits me, and now you want me to give back? Yeah, I don't think so. Keep giving. Well, that's going to come into play soon. So thank you again for your time, and I'll be happy to take questions, but I want to tell you again what an honor it is for me to be able to do this. And as many people have said, the teacher learns more than the audience. Yes, Robert?
Could you go back 2 slides?
Yes. Yep, here we go.
Okay, I'm looking at North America.
Yes.
I see an English presence. I see a Spanish presence.
Yes.
In 1803, Jefferson buys Louisiana from the French. How the hell did they get back? In other words, they have a massive amount of territory that isn't colored blue at all. So apparently they got out and got back.
Yeah, it has to do with an interchange with the Spanish government, and in the Napoleonic Wars, when France invaded Spain and displaced the Spanish monarchy, and Napoleon put his brother in charge. So in a sense, he's saying now, we control all of the Spanish territories. And when his financial picture was deteriorating, Napoleon said, what do we have to trade? Oh, we've got all this territory. So we can sell that to the Americans, and that'll help me keep fighting the wars that I'm fighting here in Europe. So in part, he was co-opting because he had put Joseph in charge.
The continent of Europe
Yeah,
that generated the purchase from the French.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like you'll see also, the same thing happened when Russia's up in Alaska and those kinds of areas. You know, they say, that's our territory and we'll sell it to you. Remember Seward's Folly, right, as it was called? Yes.
Now, when do we get Greenland?
Well, that's coming. We're getting there. Yes,
The French helped the Americans during the Revolutionary War
yes.
because they wanted to get back at England, or?
Oh, yeah,
I mean, they
very much.
forgave us for all of a sudden they came and helped us. That was
Yeah,
pretty nice.
yeah, they hate the British. Now, wait a minute, Robert, I have other questions. Yes.
A similar question about how French Canada then became French Canada.
Well,
Still is.
oh, you're talking about Quebec particularly and so on. Yes. The English did not do in Canada what they did, excuse me, in Acadia. They were perfectly willing for those people to be there, stay there. They just didn't want the hassle. And as long as they were compliant with British authority, that would be fine. But as with most things, they had a French culture and a French background. So that's what they maintained primarily. So that's why you see that very heavy French influence, which has persisted throughout. You'll also remember that on several occasions, Quebec has wanted to secede from Canada itself and form an independent state. Now we see something in British Columbia that may turn that all into Native American land. We're not sure what's happening there. But that's how it happened, yes.
Hi, why is it that really the reason why the populations of both the British troops and the French troops coming in, why was it that the Brits won out the numbers of their soldiers. Why was that?
Now, let me make sure I understand. You mean that why the French didn't have the same numbers, or?
Yes, was it because the British could come up with more troops and
Yes.
why?
Well, that's actually a very good question. The reasons were twofold. One is because of the large population in the colonies and the experiences that were growing in terms of military capability in the colonies gave the British a little more leeway. The population difference with France, or New France, was huge. Secondly, the British didn't commit troops in Europe, or what they did commit was very limited. They would rather have used their military to create their global empire and let proxies do the fighting in Europe. So it was an interesting dynamic where they recognized their own problems. They were very concerned at different times during the 7 Years' War that the French might try to invade them. But they deliberately made a decision to rely on English militia and only a few regular forces because they counted on the British Navy to keep the French from being able to invade. They had been very aware from 1745 and when they ended up fighting at Culloden, I think it was, because of the English troubles there. Yes.
An odd thing about the French colonies, we were up in Louisburg. It's one of these places which has got people dressed appropriately, wandering around. We're very, very well versed in the history. I mean, they're really good. And we learned up there that the French did not encourage their colonists to do anything much. Everything had to come by ship from France. So, that doesn't get you really going and settling.
Right.
Then we went down, Nick and I went down recently, within the past 10, 20 years, to French Guiana. And we found to our amazement that bacon and all that sort of supply came by ship from France.
Right.
They didn't grow their own hogs, no bacon, unless the ship came in.
And that's, again, an interesting element because the French government had actually been very cautious in dealing with Native Americans and didn't want to inflame their passions. Now, as I covered in some of the lectures, that happened nonetheless. But they were very considerate towards not encroaching to the degree that the English were, hoping that the Native Americans would see English encroachment and then join with the French. But there were other issues that broke that all to pieces. Other questions, anyone? Yes.
It strikes me that the fighting on the frontier was of little or no consequence. Back and forth, this and that. The real issue was Quebec and Montreal. Why in the world did the British, with their 7-to-1 advantage on the seas, their more highly skilled military, though smaller, why in the world didn't they besiege Quebec immediately? The war was won or lost in the area of the habitants of Quebec and Montreal. Why did they even bother with the Western campaign?
When you say the Western campaign, you mean like Duquesne or?
Washington's activities and Niagara and even the Champagne Valley, Lake Champlain Valley. That's not the issue. The issue is that one central area of landed individuals in Quebec and Montreal. So that's all the rest of this is all ancillary stuff.
Well, ultimately, and I'm going to speculate a little bit on answering it because I don't have any documents that I can point to that say that, as to why they didn't just muster all their naval forces and go up the St. Lawrence and take Quebec. Well, but I think what it came down to were several things. First, allocation of resources. That is, you don't have infinite resources. And at the time leading up to this war breaking out, the British strategy was not to drive the French out. They just didn't have that in their makeup. That wasn't their interest at that time. So it took a long time before you get there. Now, when you begin to get to 1754 and 55, the idea is that it still is a matter of the government deciding what are we going to do and how are we going to do it. If you take Quebec, that may have settled the issue. If you just said, we're going to put everybody on board ship, we're going to go up around, we'll just, the heck with Louisburg, we'll just sail past it, and if we take some losses, we take losses. But ultimately, the issue is, once we've taken Quebec, is the French government going to collapse in terms of saying you can keep all of New France? Or have you just changed the nature of the fighting? Are you going to run into a situation, I'll just point this out in the American Revolution at Yorktown, remember that it was the French fleet that cut off the British fleet from relieving Cornwallis. So if the French had been able to take ships up to the St. Lawrence, then perhaps, let's suppose they don't even fight a big battle, but instead they just block the river.
They couldn't do that.
Well, again, I don't have the resources to tell you they couldn't. I'm just trying to anticipate.
That technologically and numerically, the French were in bad shape on the seas.
Yes. They weren't, when you say they were in bad shape, they were still a maritime power, but not the power that the English were.
I think I just read it was 7-1.
Well, in terms of total tonnage.
And technology.
I'm not sure about the technological. There was a skill set that was different. But Robert, you had another question?
Well, the French were coming up the Mississippi. They had New Orleans, they were moving up St. Louis, and then they were gradually starting to move eastward. So this represents an issue that the British have to confront. They cannot allow the French to continue to move eastward. So it really the war had to be fought on two fronts. One, the main one, Quebec, make sure they did not have an NHL hockey team. And the other, on the western part, to make sure the French could not get any further inland towards the Atlantic.
And that's why taking the Ohio Valley mattered.
That's right.
Because that's the transit port. Yes.
I think we have to be careful not to look at it in hindsight too much.
Right.
Wars are usually started incrementally. I mean, I don't think we want to look at it from the 21st century. Now we know the logistics and the numbers. I mean, I think you have to be careful that, if I knew then what I know now, boy, I'd be really.
I don't think there's any question about the significance of Montreal and Quebec.
Oh, yeah.
But it doesn't take much foresight to see that.
Well,
that was all they had. Everybody else was on the frontier, looking for furs.
But thank you. It's a great suggestion, but I think in part your answer also, when I call it, no, but remember, think of it from this perspective. all right? You've,
Sorry, I can't.
think of it from this perspective. And I say this with myself included. We look at the information in front of us, we try to put ourselves in their position, and we ask ourselves, what options do you have? And how are you going to execute them?
Excuse me one last time. England was also facing a financial problem.
Yes,
And wasting money on this frontier nonsense doesn't make any sense to me.
I see. Well, when you say wasting money, in terms of the balance of trade was markedly in favor of the home country, markedly in favor. So the other issue was that you may remember the colonies were only allowed to trade using British ships. No other foreign nation.
Colonials were gaining an advantage there, technology.
But they had to use British ships. They couldn't use French ships, they couldn't use Dutch ships, Spanish ships. That was all verboten. Well, smuggling always occurs.
Very effective.
Especially with Jefferson.
Very effective. Especially with their advanced technology and smaller, faster vessels.
Yeah. But at the
I
time,
think salutary neglect was a mistake.
we can say that about many things, that's for sure. But thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it.
My British friend said that, you know,
One, two, three. One, two, three. One, two, three.
it's very popular. The research really.
That's what I chose to put it.
One, two, three. One, two, three. One, two, three.
Plenty of time.
One, two, three. One, two, three. One, two, three. One, two, three.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George.
My pleasure as always.
One, two, three.
My pleasure.
Now, why did you need a special knife for scalping? If I don't, well, but the scalping knife.
Well, interesting.
In case I ever want to scalp, you know.
Interestingly, again, it was a trade issue. The Indians traded for them, specifically. And remember, it wasn't the Indians that developed it, it was the British, it was actually the French. And taught Indians scalping. They were not scalping. The issue
I disagree because the Comanches and the Kiowa, the western tribes, were scalping long before in the Spanish territory.
Okay.
In fact, that's how they,
remember, there was no communication between them and the Eastern Indians.
that's how they got their boundaries. They had to show proof of death. That's how they got their The Comanche scalp just for the hell of it.
But again, to be effective, they had to be very thin bladed, because it's just a quick
Colonial has